Chapter 2, Law of the Club, and Fang. Buck's first day at Dyea Beach was like a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. He had suddenly jerked from the heart of civilization and flung into the heart of the primitive world. This was not a lazy, sun-kissed life with nothing to do but loaf and be bored. There was neither peace nor rest nor a moment's safety. Everything was confusion and action, and life and limb were in danger at every moment. There was an absolute need to always be alert, for these dogs and men were not Town's dogs and men. They were savages, all of them. The only law they knew was the law of the club and Fang. He had never seen dogs fight the way these wolfish creatures fought. His first experience taught him an unforgettable lesson. It was a second-hand experience, to be sure, or he would not have lived to profit by it. Curly was the victim. They were camped near the log store, where she in her friendly way made advances to a husky dog the size of a full-grown wolf, though not half so large as she. There was no warning, only a leap like a flash and a metallic clip of teeth, and an equally swift backward leap, and Curly's face was ripped open from eye to jaw. It was the wolf manner of fighting, to strike and leap away, but there was more to it than this. 30 to 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the fighters in an intent and silent circle. Buck did not understand the silent intentness, nor the eager way with which they were licking their chops. Curly rushed her attacker, who struck again and leapt aside. He met her next rush with his chest in a way that tumbled her off her feet. She never got up again. This is what the onlooking huskies had waited for. They closed in on her, snarling and yelping, and she was buried, screaming with agony, beneath the ragged masses of bodies. It was so sudden and so unexpected that Buck was startled. He saw Spitz run out his bright red tongue in the way he had of laughing. He saw Francois swinging an axe, springing into the mess of dogs. 3 men with clubs were helping him to scatter them off. It did not take long. 2 minutes from the time Curly went down, the last of her attackers were clubbed off. But she lay there limp and lifeless in the bloodied, trampled snow, almost literally torn to pieces, with Francois standing over her and cursing horribly. The scene often came back to Buck to trouble him in his sleep. So, that was the way. No fair play. Once down, that's the end of you. Well, he would see that he would never went down. Spitz ran out his tongue and laughed again. From that moment, Buck had hated him with a bitter and deathless hatred. Before he had recovered from that shock, caused by the horrible death of Curly, he received another shock. Francois put an arrangement of straps and buckles on him. It was a harness, such as he seen the grooms put on the horses at home. And as he seen the horses work, so he was put to work. And he hauled Francois on the sled to the forest at the edge of the valley, and they returned with a load of firewood. Though his pride was hurt by having to be a draft animal or work animal, he was too wise to rebel. He buckled down with a will and did his best, though it was all new and strange. Francois was stern. He demanded to be obeyed instantly, and by the virtue of his whip, he was obeyed instantly. Dave, who was an experienced wheeler, nipped Buck's hindquarters whenever he made a mistake. Spitz, the leader, was also experienced. While he could not always get at Buck, he growled sharply from time to time, and he would cunningly throw his weight into the traces to jerk Buck into the way he should go. Buck learned easily, and under the combined teaching of his 2 mates and Francois, he made remarkable progress. Before they returned to camp, he knew enough to stop at hoe, to go ahead at mush, and to swing wide on the turns, and to keep clear of the wheeler when the loaded sled shot down at their heels. 3 very good dogs, Francois said to Perrault. Dat Buck, him pull like hell. I teach him quick as anything. By afternoon, Perrault, who was in a hurry to be on the trail with his dispatches, returned with 2 more dogs. He called them Billy and Joe. They were brothers, and both were true huskies. Although they were sons of one mother, they were very different as day and night. Billy's one fault was to be too good-natured. And Joe is the very opposite, sour and brooding, with a constant snarl and sinister eye. Buck received them in a camaraderie way. Dave ignored them, while Spitz proceeded to clobber first one, then the other. Billy wagged his tail and turned to run when he saw that giving in was of no avail, and cried, still giving in, when Spitz's sharp teeth scored his flank. But no matter how Spitz circled, Joe whirled around on his heels to face him, mane bristling, ears laid back, lips snarling, jaws clipping together as fast as he could snap, and eyes fiendishly gleaming, the embodiment of fear fighting back. His appearance was so terrible that Spitz was forced to give up disciplining him, but to cover his own embarrassment, he turned upon the harmless and wailing Billy and drove him to the edge of camp. By evening, Perrault obtained another dog, an old husky, long and lean and gaunt. His face was battle-scarred, and his single eye flashed a warning in a way that commanded respect. He was called Solex, which means the angry one. Like Dave, he asked nothing, gave nothing, expected nothing. When he marched slowly and unhurriedly into his midst, even Spitz left him alone. He had one quirk, which Buck was unlucky enough to discover. He did not like to be approached on his blind side. Buck was unintentionally guilty of this offense. The first knowledge he had of his mistake was when Solex whirled around on him and slashed his shoulder to the bone for 3 inches up and down. Forever after, Buck avoided his blind side, and to the last of their comradeship had no more trouble. His only apparent ambition, like Dave's, was to be left alone. Buck was afterward to learn, though, that each of them possessed one another and an even more vital ambition. That night, Buck faced the greater problem of sleeping. The tent lit by a candle glowed warmly in the middle of the white plains, and Buck, as a matter of course, entered the tent. But Perrault and Francois cursed him and threw cooking utensils at him until he recovered from his fright and fled, humiliated, into the outer cold. A cold wind was blowing, and that nipped him sharply and bit with special sharpness into his wounded shoulder. He lay down on the snow and tried to sleep, but the frost soon drove him shivering to his feet. Miserable and desperate, he wandered among the many tents, only to find that one place was as cold as the other. Here and there savage dogs rushed upon him, but he bristled his neck hair and snarled, for he was learning fast, and they let him go away unharmed. Finally, an idea came to him. He returned to see how his own teammates were making out. To his amazement, they had disappeared. Again he wandered about through the great camp looking for them, and again he returned. Were they in the tent? No, that could not be, or he would not have been driven out. Then where could they possibly be? With drooping tails and shivering bodies, very forlorn indeed, he aimlessly circled the tent. Suddenly the snow gave way beneath his front legs, and he sank down. Something was wriggling under his feet. He sprang back, bristling and snarling, fearful of the unseen and unknown, but a friendly little yelp reassured him, and he went back to investigate. A whiff of warm air rose up into his nostrils, and there, curled up under the snow in a snug ball, lay Billy. He whined in a friendly way and wriggled to show his goodwill, and as a bribe of peace he even licked Buck's face with his warm, wet tongue. Another lesson. So that's the way they did it. Buck confidently selected a spot and with much fuss and wasted effort dug a hole for himself. In an instant, the heat of his body filled the narrow space and he was asleep. The day had been long and hard, and he slept soundly and comfortably, though he growled and barked and wrestled with bad dreams. Nor did he open his eyes until he was awakened by the noise of the awakening camp. At first he did not know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. The snow wall pressed in on him on every side, and a great surge of fear swept through him. It was the fear of the wild thing, for the trap. The fear was a sign that he was returning through his own life into the lives of his ancestors. and for he was a civilized dog who had no experience of traps in his own life. The muscles of his whole body contracted, and the hair on his neck and shoulders stood on end. With a fierce snarl, he bounded straight up into the blinding day, the snow flying about him in a flash of cloud. And even before he landed on his feet, he saw the white camp spread out before him. He knew where he was, and he remembered everything that had happened, from the time he went for a stroll with Manuel to the hole he dug for himself the night before. Francois shouted when Buck appeared. "What I say?" The dog driver called to Perrault. "That Buck, for sure, learn quick as anything." Perrault nodded gravely. A courier, or mailman, for the Canadian government, carrying important documents, he was anxious to obtain the best dogs, and he was particularly pleased to have Buck. Within an hour, 3 more huskies were added to a team. After another quarter of an hour had passed, they were all harnessed up and swinging up the trail toward Dyea Canyon. Buck was glad to be gone. The work was hard, but he found that he did not dislike it. He was surprised at the whole team's eagerness. Still more surprising was the change in Dave and Sol-leks. They were new dogs, completely changed by putting on a harness. Gone was their lack of energy and interest. They were now alert, active, eager that the work should go well, and impatient with anything that held their work back. Working in the traces seemed to be their main way of expressing themselves. It was the way they lived, and the only thing they took delight in. Dave was the wheeler or the sled dog. Pulling in front of him was Buck. In front of Buck was Sol-leks, and the rest of the team was strung out ahead, single file to the leader, which position was filled by Spitz. Buck had been purposely placed between David and Sol-leks so he might receive instruction. Buck was a good student, and Dave and Sol-leks were equally good teachers. They never allowed him to make a mistake for long, enforcing their teachings with their sharp teeth. Dave was fair and very wise. He never nipped Buck without a reason, and he never failed to nip him when he needed it. Francois' whip backed him up, and Buck learned that it was cheaper to change his ways than to try to get revenge. Once, during a brief halt, when he was tangled in the traces and delayed the start, both Dave and Sol-leks flew at him and gave him a sound trouncing. The tangle that resulted was even worse, but after that Buck took good care to take care of the traces and keep them clear. Before the day was over, he had mastered his work so well that his partners almost stopped nagging at him. Francois' whip snapped less often, and Perrault even honored Buck by lifting up his feet and carefully examining them. It was a hard day's run up the canyon, through the sheep camp, past the scales of the timberline, and across the glaciers and snow drifts hundreds of feet deep. They crossed the great Chilkoot Divide, which stands between the salt water and the fresh water that guards the forbidding and the sad, lonely north. They made good time down the chain of lakes that filled the craters of extinct volcanoes. Late that night they pulled into a huge camp at the head of Lake Bennett, where thousands of gold seekers were building boats in preparation for the breakup of the ice in the spring. Buck made his hole in the snow and slept the sleep of the exhausted. All too early he was awakened in the cold darkness and harnessed up with his mates to the sled. That day they made 40 miles, because the snow on the trail was already packed down. But the next day and for days after, they broke their own trail, worked harder, and made poorer time. Perrault usually traveled ahead of the team, packing the snow with his snowshoes to make it easier for them. Francois, guiding the sled at the gee pole, sometimes changed places with him, but not often. Perrault was in a hurry, and he prided himself on the knowledge of the ice. This knowledge was absolutely necessary, for the autumn ice was very thin. Where there was swift water, there was no ice at all. Day after day, Buck toiled in the traces. They always broke camp at dark, and the first gray of dawn found themselves hitting the trail with miles ahead traveling behind them. And they always picked camp after dark, eating their bit of fish and crawling to sleep in the snow. Buck was hungrier than ever. Top of page 24. That he had ever been. The pound and a half of sun-dried salmon, which was the ration for each day, seemed to go nowhere. He never had enough and suffered from constant pangs of hunger. Yet the other dogs, because they weighed less and were born to this life, received only 1 pound of fish and managed to keep in good condition. He quickly gave up his careful way that he had characterized his old life. A dainty eater, he found that his mates, finishing first, robbed him of his uneaten proportion. There was no way to protect it. While he was fighting off 2 or 3, it disappeared down the throats of the others. To prevent this, he ate as fast as they did, and still he was so hungry that he was not above taking from others. He watched and learned. Once he saw Pike, a new dog, who was a clever loafer and a thief, slyly steal a slice of bacon when Perrault's back was turned. Buck repeated the performance the following day, getting away with a whole chunk. A great uproar was raised, but Buck was not suspected. Instead, Dub, an awkward blunder, who was always getting caught, was punished for Buck's stealing. This was the first theft showed that Buck was able to successfully survive in the unfriendly North environment. It showed his ability to adjust and to change conditions. Without this ability, death would have been swift and terrible. It also marked the decay of his moral nature, which would have been a handicap in the ruthless struggle to survive. It was all well and good in the Southland under the law of love and fellowship to respect private property and personal feelings. But in the Northland, under the law of the club and the fang, whoever took such things into account was a fool who would fail to do well. Top of page 25. Not that Buck reasoned it out. He was fit, that was all. And without thinking about it, he adjusted himself to this mode of life. All his days, no matter what the odds, he had never run from a fight. But the club of the man in the red sweater had beaten it into him a more basic and primitive rule. When he was civilized, he could have died for a moral reason, such, for example, protecting Judge Miller's riding whip. His ability to turn away from his moral thinking and so save his hide showed that he now left civilization completely behind. He did not steal for the joy of it, but because of his hunger. He did not rob openly, but stole secretly and cunningly out of respect for the club and the fang. In short, he did what he did because it was easier to do it than not to do it. His development, or backsliding, was rapid. His muscles became hard as iron, and he grew uncaring about all ordinary pain. He could eat anything, no matter how revolting. Once eating, the juices of his stomach extracted every last particle of nutrition. His blood carried it to the farthest reaches of his body, building it into the toughest of muscles. Sight and scent became remarkable. His hearing became so acute that in his sleep he heard the faintest sound and knew whether it meant peace or danger. He learned to bite the ice out from his teeth when it was collected between his toes, and when he was thirsty and there was ice over the water hole, he could break it by rearing and striking it with his stiff front legs. He is becoming a wolf. His most striking trait was the ability to sense the wind and predict the direction a night in advance. No matter how still the air, when he dug his nest by the tree or bank, the wind that later blew found him on the side, top of page 26, away from the wind, and sheltered and snug. And not only did he learn by experience, but instincts, long dead, became alive again. The tame generations of his ancestors, or the wolves, fell from him. In a vague way, he remembered back to when the breed was young, to a time when wild dogs ranged in packs through the prehistoric forest and killed their meat as they ran it down. It was no task for him to learn to fight with cut and slash and quick wolf snaps. His ancestors had fought in this manner. The old trick that they had stamped into the heredity of their breed were his tricks. They came to him without effort or discovery, as though they'd always been his. And when, on a still, cold night, he pointed his nose at the stars and howled, long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors who howled down through the centuries and through him. And his howls were their howls, and the howls that voiced the meaning to them of the stillness and the cold and the dark. Thus the ancient song surged through him, and he came into his own, and this happened because a man had found yellow metal in the north, and because Manuel was a gardener's helper whose wages did not meet the needs of his wife and several children.